Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Charles Dyer, and you're listening to a reading of The All-Guardsman Party by Shaggy. Link to the full story will be in the description. I hope you enjoy. And as always, stay alive out there. So no shit, there we were. Standing slack-jawed in the rubble of a crime lord's private museum, watching the sorceress we just chased through the whole damn mansion making out with Bane fucking Johns, as their gunship flew off into the sunset. After a few seconds of disgusted silence, Doc and Sarge cleared their weapons and made a spirited attempt to interrupt the pair's romantic event. None of their shots came even remotely close. Down on the floor, Tink and Twitch stopped clutching at their respective injuries as they registered the familiar, if a bit deeper than usual sound of someone overcharging a plasma weapon on the floor above. Tink flipped through his comm channels and shouted a futile warning, while Twitch yanked a catatonic nubby into a corner a split second before a bright blue explosion collapsed a large section of the ceiling. As the rest of us coughed and dug our way out of the rubble, Tink implied his way up the pile of rubble, poked his head out of the smoldering crater, and informed what was left of the other inquisitorial team that he'd told them so. The old Guardsman party and the... redacted. Error. The return of Bane Johns. Fortunately for our mouthy techie, nobody upstairs was in any condition to beat the shit out of him. In fact, the only one of them that even seemed aware of our arrival was the fringe worlder who waved at us with a bloody stump of his right arm and asked how y'all's part of the mission was going. Sarge managed to convey an entire after-action report's worth of disgust and annoyance with a single grunt, which got a weak laugh from the man and a disapproving look from Doc as he tourniqueted the bleeding limb. While Doc began triaging what was left of the other team, deciding to start with their interrogator whose power armor had somehow failed to stop a dozen auto-pistol rounds, Sarge's attention was caught up by a large figure in blackened, smoking Sororitas power armor struggling out of a hole in the wall. The big sister stumbled over the windows and tossed the half-slagged remains of a plasma cannon out of them, yanked her equally ruined helmet off, and began screaming a string of decidedly unsisterly Vostorian curses at a group of the distant gunship. Sarge blinked as he finally recognized the face and voice as belonging to Ivana Krushu, former minion of the traitorous Lord General Oromov and one of Bane's John's numerous girlfriends before he'd been hauled off to by the Inquisition. Sarge, no longer feeling capable of surprise, just let out a disgusted sigh at the universe's perverse sense of humor and asked the Valkyrian woman if she had any injuries that needed treatment. She stared at him for a second, and then dropped to her knees, screaming and clutching at her head. The last two members of the other team that we couldn't find weren't doing noticeably better than Ivana. Tink found what was left of their tech priest in a crater full of blood, lubricant, and assorted servitor bits, and after a bit of highly scientific stick-poking, declared the cogboy to be super-duper dead. The tech priest in question took offense to this, loudly complaining, "You take one nap and you're a pool of your own body fluids, and people start declaring you all sorts of things." He informed Tink that unlike some people, he could operate just fine without his appendages and in an apocalyptic low-power environments, as well as a few as 1.1 volts too. Thank you very much. If someone would be so kind as to dig him out, top up his internal battery, and drag him to a servitor workshop, he'd arranged for Tink to try being limbless torso and see how he looked. Tink was understandably a bit hesitant about helping the cogboy, but was informed that he's just a bit of a dick wasn't a valid excuse for leaving an ally to bleed out. The ganger was in better shape physically, but mentally she definitely was a bit out of it. She just kept staring out the window, seemingly unaware of our arrival or the fact that she was sitting on the remains of what appeared to be one of the interrogator's murder dogs. Twitch, interpreting this shockiness as a sign of demonic possession, as opposed to, shock, threw a vial of holy water at her, which at least brought her attention back to the general orbital vicinity, if not all the way back down to Earth, as it were. Despite Twitch's insistence that she wasn't as angry as she should have been, and was potentially harboring a gene-stealer parasite or something, the dampened ganger was allowed to keep her various weapons, we didn't have a spare space for them anyway, and was tasked with getting the wounded fringe worlder up and moving. Back across the room, Ivana finally transitioned from tortured screaming to a mix of hysterical giggling and tears. Not being emotionally equipped to deal with a crying woman in general, much less one a head taller and twice as burly as himself, Sarge decided this probably meant that she was uninjured and beat a rather cowardly retreat. He'd only gotten a few steps before the crying had abruptly stopped and a large power-armored hand grabbed him by the shoulder. Her deep, scarily focused voice informed him that he was needed for a thing right now. Sarge made a small, whimpering noise. To our not-so-fearless leader's relief, he was only dragged over to where Doc was failing to treat the other team's interrogator's numerous auto-pistol wounds. Completely ignoring the medic and his work, Ivana saluted her half-dead interrogator, and in a parade ground voice announced that Interrogator Sergeant was formally requesting to transfer to their team. The requestee's confused "I am" earned him a glare, a possibly broken shin, and a threatening "Yes, yes you are." Sarge wisely decided to just go with it and hope that it wouldn't all end in some sort of inquisitorial tribunal for gross misconduct. In a complete farce of inquisitorial procedure, with Ivana creatively interpreting the pained gurgles from her superior officer, Sarge was inducted into the retinue of Inquisitor What's-His-Name. Then, since said Inquisitor had been seen being sucked screaming into a hole in the warp after trying to use his psyker powers on Bane, and his interrogator had apparently kicked the bucket mid-ceremony, Sarge was appointed Acting Inquisitor, handed a shiny Ordo Hereticus rosette, and put in charge of the team. At least, that's what Ivana said was going on. The Fringe Worlder accused her of being crazier than a bag of something or other, but recommended we just play along and keep the rosette anyway from her until we'd gotten out of there. We quietly agreed with him. The other team having been collected, literally in the Tech Priest's case, Doc raised the question of where our teammates were and why we'd gone the entire 5 minutes without Cesariat yelling at us. Tink answered the latter by poking at his comm bead for a second before hastily deactivating it and informing everyone that A, plasma interference or space fairies or something had fouled our comms so they needed to be restarted, and B, the Inquisitor really wanted to talk to Sarge. Given the fact that we were in the middle of both a crime lord's mansion and a large-scale assault by the planetary secret police, Sarge kept his report on the half-furious, half-frantic Cesariat brief, leaving out the hard-to-explain details about Ivana and Bane and such. The Inquisitor stuck to the basics as well, settling for just a few darkly sarcastic comments when he learned about the Inquisitor's death and the Sorceress's escape with the evil box thing. The mission being well and truly scrubbed, we were given the order to pull out. The original plan called for extracting via the parking garage, but we were quick to point out that since the secret police had launched their attack from that way, we probably weren't going to be able to reach the fancy getaway cars, and even if we could get to them, they'd likely been damaged in the fighting or something. It was probably best not to even try recovering them. Cicitat seemed suspicious, but grudgingly guided us on a path to recover our surviving teammates and exit via the route which the second team had used to get in. Nubby was picked up from where he'd just been left moping heartbrokenly around the wrecked art museum, and was attached to the shell-shocked ganger who just nodded along vacantly with self-pitying monologue. From there, we made our way back to the trail of destruction Bane had left in his wake, collecting what was left of our teammates who tried to attack the 2 decoy sorceresses and ran afoul of their bodyguard. Of the 4 of them, the death cult assassin was dead. He tried to knife fight Bane. Face was still breathing but completely catatonic and bleeding out from the eyes. Doc put this down to warp bullshit and said he'd probably be fine, or he'd turn into a demon host. One or the other. The cleric had been shot. Again. One or more of the interrogator's cybernetic murder dogs was definitely dead, and another had been last seen sailing out of a window, but the woman herself had made it through unscathed thanks to her decision to chase the decoys instead of Bane. Thankfully, the cleric was still capable of walking, so only Face had to be carried, and the interrogator was actually being cooperative for a change. We expected yet another argument about who was in charge, or at least some incessant whining about her dead pets, but she just quietly fell into line in the back of the group, and even followed Sarge's orders. We were incredibly grateful for this, given the difficulty of sneaking our whole ragged little patrol past all the goons and secret police. Twitch declared it to be incredibly suspicious, though, and Ivana constantly seemed to be watching the interrogator when we weren't on the move, too. It took us 3 hours and a whole lot of stairs to make it down to where the Crime Lord's little sub-spire connected to the hive, and then back up to the vehicle-accessible area that wasn't crawling with planetary secret police. The only real moment of interest was a brief firefight with the bodyguards of some noble fleeing the giant Charlie Foxtrot above, at the end of which Ivana's half-slagged power armor finally gave up the ghost. The Sororitas armor was unceremoniously ditched in a closet. The torsified tech priest in Tink's backpack loudly complained that he'd just fixed the stuff after some asshole with a plasma gun shot the power unit. He then directed said asshole in the looting of some good bits of the discarded armor, which might be useful in fixing some of the long list of obvious amateur mistakes someone had on their plasma weapon. Tink asked if someone else should carry the tech priest, but was informed that they made a cute couple. Also, on that note of Ivana, the disarmed fringe warlord pulled some of us aside for a few words to explain her in short. She was crazy, like actually certifiably. His boss had snagged her up for no other reason to spite Oak for trying to recruit her on Hereticus time, which explained a lot, and she'd subsequently undergone some psycho-assisted re-education, which explained even more. His point was that Ivana was sweeter than something full of somethings, but even if we'd served with her before, as he was suspecting, it wouldn't be a good idea to bring up her past, on her fixation on inquisitorial authority, or whether she was actually a sister of battle, or certain varieties of mixed drinks. Best if we didn't talk to her at all, really. Eventually, given that the woman in question had twisted one of her bodyguard's head off like a bottle cap and was alternating between glaring at our other female companions and eyeing Sarge with downright disquieting level of intensity. The scan van was waiting for us at our eventual exit, along with the definitely not full of orcs truck, which was being driven by two heavily armed men we didn't recognize, but the fringe worlder vouched for. We decided that these strange men, who'd almost certainly been tasked with killing our team in the event that we double-crossed their now-dead Inquisitor, were just the folks to take the large collection of wounded teammates, with one specific exception, off for medical treatment by their team's actual real doctor. Sysitat probably didn't agree with that judgment, but we were suffering from mysterious comm interference. Once the truck had pulled out, we directed our attention to the scan van, or more specifically its driver. During the hike out, the question of what to do about a certain problematic tech priest had been raised, and the other priest had been tapped for some expert advice in dealing with this die-hard orthodox counterpart. This wasn't intentional, we just forgot that he was in Tink's pack and he could totally hear us. In any case, he cheerfully suggested that turning our cogboy off and on again with our las guns. Admittedly, the on-again part would be tricky, but he thought it was still worth a shot. We decided we liked the torso priest. Doc entered the scan van via the rear door, triggering an attack of horrible nausea in the exhausted psyker occupying it. Seeing the man's discomfort, Doc graciously administered a dose of anti-nausea medication, which had the completely accidental side effect of knocking Snitch out cold. In the front of the van, Lexomechanic Thomas de Torque's attempt to localize the signal jamming his Vox connection to the Inquisitor were interrupted by someone knocking on the passenger door. He was still trying to explain the dolt outside that the door was locked and would remain that way when the window behind him exploded in a shower of safety glass and a pair of beefy arms seized him by the neck. As the tech priest's data feeds were ripped from their sockets and he was dragged kicking and screaming out of the broken window, he reflected on the wisdom of antagonizing a bunch of people who viewed violence as more of a first resort than last thing. Thomas heard, aside from the las and plasma fire, was a muffled mechanical voice calling dibs on his limbs. He hoped that it was the Omnissiah. Sysitat was less pleased to find out his tech priest had been replaced with a new, lighter weight model. For some reason, he didn't seem willing to believe Sarge's report of a last-second sneak attack on the scan van, even with all the super-realistic combat sound effects being supplied in the background by Twitch and a slightly cheered-up Nubby. That said, the Inquisitor didn't really seem angry about the brutal murder of a trusted subordinate, so much as annoyed at the great personal inconvenience it would cause him, whining about how much of his valuable time it would take to bring the new cogboy up to speed, and so on. In retrospect, why we'd expected any other response was a mystery. So yeah, Sysitat took the news pretty well. Right up until Sarge sort of accidentally mentioned Bane and Angelica. By name and rank. Doc and Twitch tackled Sarge and took away his comm bead, but the enraged screaming had already started by that point. So we just went with Plan B and Tink reactivated the jammer. Our new tech priest informed us that we were idiots delaying the inevitable, and Doc politely reminded him that we were Guardsmen. The beauty of Plan B was that between the limb attachment, a process which involved a lot of sarcasm and backseat surgerying from the patient, and the interhive traffic delays caused by some big dust storm thing and all the Arbeit patrols, we got 12 hours of napping in before the inevitable shit show of the debriefing. This was a very good thing because the revelation that not just one, but both of the conspiracy agents were our ex-bosses didn't go over well with the Inquisitor, or anyone else for that matter, especially the two new guys from the other team who turned out to be real inquisitorial stormtroopers and were therefore a little bit ill-disposed towards us. It was only Sysitat's repeated assurances that we were too stupid to have actually planned everything that kept us from being branded as traitors on the spot. Sarge thanked him for his support. That set the tone for the rest of the debrief, though admittedly it could have been worse. For instance, the tech priest might have still been alive. That thought alone was enough to keep morale up through the whole thing. Also, Snitch was too wiped out to do much of his usual fact-checking, so that was nice, and Face spent most of the meeting lying in a corner muttering, "Wiggle your big toe," to himself. The interrogator was doing a little better, see, bitchy, but some of the sort of feud with Ivana drew most of her fire off of us. So it was mostly just Sysitat and the cleric and the two stormtroopers picking everything apart and finding varying degrees of fault with our every action. Despite a strong temptation to throw Nubby under the proverbial bus, we responded to the nitpicking with a mixture of apathy, antipathy, and in Twitch's case, sociopathy. As far as we were concerned, the reappearance of our old bosses had changed the nature of the mission, and we were no longer had time for these silly little games. Eventually, Sysitat and his minions took the hint and moved on to more productive subjects. It was amusing to watch as they realized that the only people with actual intel on Bane and Angelica were the ones that they spent the last 2 hours bad-mouthing. Not that it stopped them from constantly interrupting our report. To say that the stories of our past missions with the two ex-interrogators was met with a little skepticism doesn't quite cover it. You're making this up, bullshit, and if that actually happened, I'm an orc in a dress. Why, is he looking at me like that? Sums up a bit better. Things started to go downhill pretty quick until our considerable surprise, Sysitat stepped in and told everyone to shut up and actually listen to us. Unfortunately, any gratitude we felt for this intervention evaporated when we got our patented DTU strategy, and the Inquisitor pointed out that this was probably why the secret police had been rounding up every untouchable on the planet. The real kicker was finding out that everyone, including Ivana, who literally had brain damage, had been told except for us. We dearly missed the days when Sysitat attended meetings in person because we could have shot him like he deserved. Anyway, despite her supposed memory problems, Ivana also chimed in to claim Bane had some sort of subtle mind control powers, and that these had already been used on the Ganger, which explained why she wasn't present. Ivana's teammates backed her up on this, but we were less supportive when she went on to accuse our interrogator of being compromised as well. Twitch was totally on board though, and excitedly began listing all of the suspicious ways our nominal superior had been acting. He probably should have stuck to just the post-mission stuff, though. The amazingly detailed log of her personal hygiene habits and what fiendish plots they might be hiding really didn't help his argument. To Sysitat's credit, he took Ivana's, if not Twitch's, accusations seriously enough to wake Snitch up and have the psyker take a few pokes at his interrogator's brain, despite some pretty strong protests on her part. Unfortunately, he had a bit of less patience when Snitch declared her to be clean outside of the influence, and Ivana still persisted. The term crazy bitch was used a few times. Eventually, between her teammates and Sarge's own reassurances, Ivana was convinced to settle for a vague promise to keep an eye on our interrogator. Since things had pretty much stalled by this point, Sarge decided it was time to raise the question of just what in the Emperor's name we were going to do about Bane and Angelica. The Fringe Worlder earned our undying approval by immediately suggesting nuking them from orbit, but this was shot down by Sysitat on the grounds that it would destroy the artifacts in their possession. Twitch grimly added that he wouldn't believe Bane was dead unless he personally saw the body. Even if we called in a full exterminatus, some scavengers would probably just find him a few weeks later in a stasis-equipped refrigerator up in orbit or something. Doc hushed him, and Sarge took the floor to present Plan C. Plan C, and A and B being the aforementioned untouchable and nuke it from orbit, consisted of separating our two ex-bosses through some vaguely defined trickery, dealing with Angelica using literally all of the explosives, and just throwing disposable bodies at Bane until he got tired from killing them. As plans went, it was admittedly a bit of work in progress, but we felt it set a good general theme to start with. The torso tech priest raised the question of whether Bane was or wasn't a demon host, and how that would affect tiring him out. Tink pointed out that A, with Bane, how could you tell, and B, either way, his powers were warpy, and if you keep using warp powers for long enough, you'll either explode or turn into a demon host. It's how magic works. Nobody argued with either point, though Tink did get some pushback when he went on to suggest that we could accelerate the process by adding a few disposable psychers to the mix. The argument was progressing nicely, and was on the edge of turning into a real plan when Sysitat broke in to inform everyone that we wouldn't be doing that. Any of that. The Inquisitor explained to us slow people, that our mission was to get the artifacts, not kill rogue Inquisition agents. Everyone present stared at him with an incredulity at that statement that definitely warranted, until Doc bit the bullet and asked how he intended to get anything done without at the very least killing Bane first. Sysitat just rolled his eyes and explained that the way you deal with tactically superior enemy was to plan around their strengths and outmaneuver them on a strategic level. It was okay. He didn't expect us to understand. To our disgust, several of the other theoretically sane people present actually nodded along with the Inquisitor's bullshit. Sarge took a deep breath, summoned up every ounce of his half-assed diplomatic training, and attempted to convince Sysitat that he wasn't quite grasping the scope of Bane's powers. He was not successful. We belatedly realized that despite not being physically involved in the recent mess, the Inquisitor hadn't been having the best day. When Sarge tried to explain how terrible his idea was and how dead we would all be attempting it, some sort of dam burst inside the man. It was, well, you couldn't call it impressive exactly. What with his stature and the fact that he was only a hologram, but it was definitely a bit surprising. Like being savaged by a fat little dog, a yappy one. It would have been hilarious if he wasn't our direct superior. Sysitat's little tantrum ended with him declaring us banned from all meetings and ordered us to do some things, very important things at least 2 hives away from here. Tink smugly pointed out that it would be a bad tricky given that we'd left our van parked. The Inquisitor almost grinned as he pulled up a hologram of a tiny 3-wheeled vehicle ground car and informed us that the tech priest had managed to order us a replacement before his unfortunate demise. Certain people around the table snickered. Snitch began to inform everyone what we thought of our new ride, but paused at a glare from Sarge, who very pointedly remained in his seat. After a few seconds of mutual glaring, Sysitat pulled up another hologram, this time of a familiar, massive, armored figure standing in front of a whole precinct of Arbites. Nubby swore and threw one of the several beer bottles he'd emptied in the course of the meeting through it. The Inquisitor ignored this and grimly informed the rest of us that if we couldn't even follow the simplest orders, he knew a certain rising star in the Arbites, who'd probably be willing to trade all sorts of support for information regarding a van full of Guardsmen. We, regrettably, took the hint. It was as we were prying a very drunk Nubby off of the floor. We had no idea where he kept getting bottles from. Doc gave up trying to confiscate them after the 9th one and decided it was probably for the better to let the heartbroken trooper just drink his sorrows away. But anyway, as we were pulling him up, the little idiot, that's when it happened. Threat made, Sysitat had dropped us from his attention and began outlining his plan for integrating what was left of the other team into ours, under his interrogator. Ivana leapt to her feet, but instead of an explosion that we were expecting, she merely announced that her team couldn't agree to any reassignment without authorization from their inquisitorial superior. This outburst mostly just earned her the same mix of confused and annoyed looks Twitch remarks usually got, except for the fringe worlder, who sighed and pulled his hat down over his face, the torso priest, who was very suddenly at the far end of the room, and Sarge, who was too busy staring at Sysitat's hologram trying to see if it was possible to hate someone to death to notice until Doc kicked him in the shin. Sarge suffered a brief moment of panic as he registered the better part of 150 kilos of woman staring at him like a starving dog eyes a poorly guarded bacon sandwich, and then finally remembered what he had in his pocket. The series of changes in our fearless leader's expression as the situation finally hit him was really something to see, but it had nothing on the reaction around the table when acting Inquisitor Greg Sargent pulled his blood-spattered Ordos Hereticus rosette out of his pocket and formally denied Ivana permission to join Syssitat's team. Now, when you're committing something that might technically be considered a mutiny, especially against the Inquisition, it's important to keep up your momentum. Best to not get bogged down in the little things like the actual meaning of the rules and ordinances you're citing, or whether they even really exist for that matter. Which is why the first thing we did after Sarge's announcement was mute Syssitat's hologram. The second was to position Doc as close as possible to Snitch, who quickly turned green and spent the rest of his meeting trying, and eventually failing, to keep his lunch down. The playing field nicely leveled, Sarge delivered his pitch. Now, over the past month, we'd given our fearless leader no end of shit for his little diplomacy lessons and their lackluster results, but this is where they finally paid off. He might not have had quite the poise or menace of a real Inquisitor, and probably shouldn't have referred to his predecessor as Inquisitor What's-His-Name, but he still managed it amazingly well, all things considered. Sarge explained that we were going to go off and start our own team, just us, Guardsman, and Ivana, and we were going to go kill Bane and Angelica. Nobody from the other team was required or even asked to come with us. They had their very own, very important mission to complete after all, and it would no doubt be easier to accomplish with their two primary opponents dead. Of course, we'd still liaise, cooperate, and share critical fucking intel, and with them, just like any other friendly Inquisition team would, but they had their objective, we had ours, and that was all there was to it. I'd like to say that we left to a mixture of stunned silence and scattered applause, but it was a more like, you won't last 10 minutes atmosphere. The moment was spoiled even further when a few minutes later, Doc poked his head back in to ask if the Torso Priest could give us a ride, since there was no way we were ever going to fit Ivana into our three-wheeled thing. 4 days later, the C-Team convened in the briefing room of Fort Kickass for the first real planning session of Operation Kill Our Old Bosses. The first order of business was revoking Tink's naming privileges. Our new base, whatever it was called, was located in the middle levels of the planetary capital, Seven Hive. We hadn't actually intended to move a third of the way across the planet. It was just that our original plan to simply take over the other team's base met with a bit of opposition. Well, not so much opposition as armed resistance, specifically from two stormtroopers. Syssitat had apparently flown them out ahead of us, and they didn't seem to agree with us about which of their former boss's assets should pass on to his completely legitimate successor. Words and a few death threats were exchanged in the doorway before an agreement was finally brokered by the Fringe Worlder. We left with a big box of Ivana stuff, a single data slate labeled Person of Interest the Sorceress, and an IOU for one inquisitorial mission budget. Admittedly, not the best deal we've ever made, but given our usual negotiator spent the whole time drunkenly sobbing in a corner, well, we had to make do with what we could get. Honestly, it wasn't like we really needed the budget or intel. Those were just what the guard referred to as luxuries. A proper soldier knew how to scrounge. For starters, we needed a vehicle we could drive ourselves, and preferably wasn't filled with listening devices piping our every word to our third worst enemy in the system. Fortunately, there were two of them just sitting unattended in that garage. Judging by what they yelled after us, the stormtroopers didn't think their cargo truck and brand new flyer had been part of the deal, but we really didn't see how that was our problem. That truck served us well over the next few days. The flyer, well, it occurred to us that there was a bit more ground traffic on the planet than was normal, but we'd put that on down to local custom or whatever. It never occurred to us that there was an actual legitimate reason until Tink reached the edge of the Jack Hive and saw how much bigger the little dust storm had gotten since we had driven through on the way back to the mission. I mean, none of us were desert worlders. We'd thought the giant force shields over the hives had been an orbital defense or something. What sort of messed up planet has sandstorms that cover whole continents? And why would anyone ever build hives on this one? We asked some of the locals, but all we ever got was some bullshit about planetary ecology and rogue traders working in mysterious ways. Anyway, we'd already decided that it'd be best if we left the Jack Hive, so we wound up just hawking the flyer instead of trying to figure out how to transport it via our armored shuttle. Of course, Doing this required getting Nubby sobered up and at least nominally functional, which was a project all on its own. Doc made liberal use of the various anti-something or other pills that had come with Ivana's stuff. They'd been handed over by a pudgy old woman who we assumed was the team's surgeon, and had come with a detailed administration guide, but Ivana insisted that she really didn't need all or really any of them, so we had plenty to force down Nubby's throat until the desired result was achieved. Doc hadn't exactly approved this treatment, not that any of the medical ethics or substance dependency stuff had stopped him from administering the pills. He just complained a lot while doing it. Sarge promised we'd figure out a better solution involving an actual licensed therapist once we got to our new base. Getting to said new base went smoothly enough, all things considered. Our exit from Jack Hive was made slightly interesting by a large number of traffic cops and Arbite patrols, suspiciously large in our opinion. Fortunately, the low Hive route Nubby used flyer guy sent us on got us past most of them, and one traffic cop that didn't stop us didn't seem to know what to do when he encountered Ivana in the driver's seat. We heard him muttering about transvestite truckers as he stalked back to his bike. Once on the Interhive, it was smooth, if a tad windy, driving to 7, which was chosen as our destination for the simple reason that it was where the dossier said that Angelica and the secret police were based. Admittedly, that was probably the exact reason why Sysitat and the other team hadn't made their bases there, but we felt that we were overthinking things a bit. The place was a hive, damn it. They're big, even with Bane's bullshittery. We highly doubted she'd be able to keep the whole place on lockdown. The border, though, and the big vehicle inspection checkpoints leading through it, that was a slightly different story. Fortunately, we were highly trained, inquisitorial agents. Now, whatever passed for the Inquisitorial Handbook probably has a whole chapter dedicated to inserting oneself into hostile territory without raising suspicion. There's got to be pages and pages about disguises, facial reconstruction, falsified identification documents, black market traffickers, and probably even more about how to covertly make contact with the local authorities. We didn't do any of that. Instead, we drove right up in the lane marked military, showed the inspector and duty officer a stack of perfectly legitimate, if a bit dog-eared, papers identifying us as Guardsmen of the Generian 99th Medium Infantry, and asked to be billeted while the Administratum sorted out what to do with us. Very sneaky. We could almost hear the various people who'd futilely tried to instill inquisitorial professionalism into us sighing and rolling their eyes as we were processed through the checkpoint and escorted to the third largest PDF base in the Hive. They weren't Guardsmen, though. They didn't understand the colossal inefficiency, inflexibility, and general incompetency that was the Departamento Munitorum, well, at least when applied to any problem smaller than a planetary invasion. There were stories of entire misplaced regiments who'd settled, started families, died of old age, and passed into local legend before the regiment orders came through, at which point they were presumably dug up by their descendants and shipped off to the front, much to the exasperation of whichever Lord General was running the operation, not to mention the poor grunts holding out for reinforcements. The point is that we probably had a good year or 7 before anyone in the Administratum noticed our unexpected resurrection, and while the locals might be a bit more on the ball, they were also a lot easier to mislead, confuse, bully, and bribe. Add to that we were real Guardsmen, with the scars and war stories to prove it, and well, by the end of the day we probably had our very own barracks with attached motor pool, plus a sack of chitties for the base mess, from the base mess, several sets of insignialess Harlockian PDF fatigues, and even an advance on our first week's pay. Certain people were in favor of putting in for the years of back pay we officially had coming too, and maybe some travel comp if Tink could fabricate the proper documents, but Sarge ruled it was better to quit while we were ahead. It wasn't like we really needed the money anyway. Between the flyer and the several miscellaneous items from our former teammates we hadn't really needed, there was a few small shiny objects that had fallen into Nubby's pockets while we'd been in the Crime Lord's little art museum. We had the budget situation fairly covered. On the note of our quartermaster, once we'd settled, Doc put his foot down and refused to give Nubby any more Inquisition-strength anti-crazy pills, at least until he could find a list of their side effects, not to mention some actual dosage recommendations. He hadn't much liked the zombie-ish way the little trooper had been shuffling along the last few days. Sarge promised the medic that once Nubby had come fully down, they'd have a heart-to-heart about the whole girlfriend thing. Unfortunately, the Nomcom got a bit distracted with all his newfound inquisitorial duties, and by the time he actually got around to it, the little trooper had vanished. A few hours of frantic searching turned Nubby up in a base-adjacent watering hole, regaling an entire bar full of PDF troopers with a thoroughly classified tale of heartbreak and woe. Fortunately, for the little idiot's life, it was Doc and Twitch who found him, not Sarge, and none of the troopers seemed to actually believe any of his "my hot Inquisitor girlfriend left me for the galaxy's most annoying secret agent" bullshit. Doc and Twitch quietly paid his tab, and dragged his drunkenly protesting ass out the door before he violated operational security any further. Once back at base, he was tied to a chair, sobered up, and given the talk. This was not your usual the talk. It did start that way with the typical "she was using you. You've got to move on." And it was never really like that. The problem is that the last one isn't supposed to be quite so literal. Yes, he did spend a lot of his time with her and had been given quite a few mementos to remember her by, but those were more grounds for a restraining order than a deep heartfelt relationship. And then there was the weeks of one-sided conversation with her while she was medically paralyzed next to him in the medbay, and similarly one-sided pen-pal relationship afterwards. Sarge and Doc both tried, but they had to keep stopping to go and alternatively laugh and swear at the perversity of it all. It was draining. It was frustrating. Doc was ready to go back to the pills and possibly grab a few for himself, and Sarge was considering the merits of locking the idiot up in the brig for the rest of the mission. But eventually, they got through to him. Except by they, I mean Twitch and Ivana, who shelved the whole love issue in favor of focusing on Angelica's newfound relationship with Bane, and to an, unexpectedly detailed degree. The end result was, well, acceptable. Simmering, betrayed rage, at least insofar as Nubby was capable of that emotion, was an improvement over drunken, heartbroken sobbing after all. Even if it did come along with frequent rants about how nobody could ever compare someone as unquestionably lesser as Bane Johns to such an upstanding individual as Nubby Nubs, valiant hero of the Imperium and all-around nice guy. We took what we could get, as there was shit to do, and people to kill. First things first, we needed a plan with a little bit less "huh" in it, and for that we needed intel. Problem was that intelligence gathering wasn't exactly our strong suit. It's what we'd always had all those adepts for, after all. Still, though, given some of those adepts, not to mention interrogators and inquisitors, we figured it couldn't be too hard, right? To start with, Sarge went to have a chat with his PDF counterparts, especially the salty old bastards at the training compound a few levels down Hive from our home base. It's a little-known fact outside of the Guard, but soldiers are quite possibly the biggest gossips that you'll ever find. Washerwomen, barmaids, and upper-crust socialites have nothing on a squad of bored troopers on work detail or lounging around their barracks with nothing to do. Want to make a juicy secret public knowledge? Mention it within earshot of one of those expressionless, easily ignorable gate guards, and every trooper and regiment will know it by the next chow call. It's a widely believed fact that the military grapevine can actually outpace the Astra Telepathica if the story's good enough, that is. NCOs are no exception to this rule. In fact, they're the ones with the juiciest tidbits. It's just a matter of getting them talking. Sarge could do this easily. The real challenge was getting them to shut up again once they got going. As I mentioned before, it's been said that the military grapevine can actually outpace the Astra Telepathica if the story's good enough, which is where the problem lies for inquisitorial types. Secret heretic cabals, shadowy puppet masters, and secessionist plots don't really qualify as interesting, at least not according to your average grunt. If Sarge had gone in there trying to get info on Angelica and her conspiracy buddies, he'd have probably struck out. Well, maybe not if one of them had seen her in person, but even then it wouldn't be her nefarious plots or political maneuvering that they'd be talking about. Fortunately, though, our other target just so happened to be Bane Johns, self-styled interplanetary man of mystery, and just about the least subtle person this side of the Eye of Terror. Sarge didn't even have to try. The second story he heard was about someone gunning down an entire Underhive street racing ring for stealing his car, finding out it had actually been towed, and somehow winding up sleeping with the daughters of the Hive traffic control coordinator, all while blind drunk. The third, sixth, and eighth stories were all Bane too, and it didn't take long to find out where there was actually a celebrity tabloid dedicated entirely to him. It was honestly sort of sad, especially when Sarge realized he'd seen the tabloid on sale weeks ago. It definitely raised a question of what the hell Sysitat and his minions had been doing all this time. I mean, how do you just ignore something like gas attack on planetary rare metal reserve, business mogul thrown from private flyer, deadly hat attacks, famous aerobatics ace falls in love? You'll never guess what these four things have in common. It didn't take long for Sarge to pinpoint the general region Bane called home, get in touch with the PDF and Hive forces that patrolled the area, and ask them some pertinent questions. By the end of 2 weeks, we knew everything about the man's location, habits, and relation with the locals to plan our hit, at least as far as Bane was concerned. Angelica and the variably length leash she kept the man on were a whole other matter. Sarge did try, and even push the more easygoing of his new NCO buddies for info on the secret police, but there were limits to even what the most drunkest of drill sergeants would talk about. Tink had a bit more luck digging through the PDF's poorly secured comm records, at least finding some persons of interest files describing Sysitat in oddly high detail, as well as most of our former teammates and 7 rogue inquisitorial stormtroopers. It was a bit offensive to be lumped in like that. We'd have thought that Angelica at least would have remembered us better. Nubby was the only one who even rated a description, and that was just a horrid-smelling, rattling mascot who steals underwear. Tink did find some more accurate POI notices coming from the Arbites, though, but they described us as guard deserters, which we were very provably weren't. In any case, Sarge kept working his new beer buds for every scrap that they'd part with, and the rest of us got our shit together for a good old-fashioned strike. While Sarge sarged with the Sarges, Nubby, once he'd been sorted out, did his usual thing. Within a worryingly short amount of time, he was wheeling and dealing with an underutilized storage shed and steadily expanding both our budget and the list of guys that he knew. The information he got as part of the process was a tad dubious, and the rest of us weren't quite sure if it was worth all the arguments with the base MPs, but all was forgiven when he finally got in touch with a certain corruptible quartermaster in the armory. Twitch practically cried when he cracked open the first crates, plural, of jetpacks, mines, razor wire, grenades, and other types of grenades, and assorted anti-armor ordnance. The rest of us were a bit more interested in the box containing half a dozen excellent quality hotshot lasguns with full attachments, and a nice standard guard issue, hopefully machine spirit-free plasma gun. Tink, modified Astartes' weapon, was gleefully tossed into the nearest trash can, which immediately caught fire. He was less happy when Sarge made him put out the trash fire, fish the gun back out, and then strip his modifications and get the thing reconsecrated. You know, just in case any Space Marines come asking for it later. There was probably a limit to how much Astartes war gear we could misplace, after all. Anyway, once Twitch was resupplied, the ensuring frenzy of fortification was everything we'd wanted over the weeks in that damn hab. It did wonders for our relations with the military police, too. Just one little incident was all it took for them to decide they'd rather submit politely worded notes via post instead of banging on our doors in the middle of the night. Of course, there were some raised eyebrows up at the local brass, but a little extra fortification is far from the oddest thing visiting guard regiments have done, especially if you include Feral World or regiments and or Ogrins. So they didn't pick up or kick up too much of a fuss, and Sarge got them sorted in exchange for a promise not to extend the perimeter any farther. As one of the particularly annoying PDF commissars who started poking his nose where it wasn't welcome, possibly for the same Nubby-related reasons that the MPs had been, a short chat with Twitch and our Valhallan auxiliary convinced him it really wasn't any part of our craziness. In fact, he was firmly convinced that we should be kept as far away from his troops as possible, just in case we were contagious or something. Aside from a bit of cogitator work for Sarge, Tink's primary job was gear prep, which included a little pet project he'd been planning for years now. See, despite not being nearly as paranoid as Twitch, our techies still embraced the old guard motto, have a plan to kill everyone you meet. Preferably from as far away as possible. Ever since his first mission under Bane and its anticlimactically blood-free ending, he'd been idly chewing on the problem of how to deal with someone capable of that level of bullshittery. Skipping over some of the more harebrained stuff, one of his more promising ideas was a way to counter all the misfires, jams, and plasma-related mishaps that plagued anyone firing a weapon in Bane's weird probability-skewing danger zone. His solution had something to do with choosing tuning and using weapons in a way that provided maximum damage for minimum danger, or max-min, meaning the danger per shot. As he put it, honestly, none of the rest of us really followed the fine details or understood why Tink needed so much firing range time or how many boxes of assorted weapons, including the oldest, most used las guns in the range's armory for some reason, but Doc assured us that it was all very scientific. In addition to translating and meditating for Tink, especially when the techie's request for a platoon of slack-jawed PDF yahoos to fire these guns for me raised issues with a decidedly non-slack-jawed range officer, Doc was put in charge of liaising with the inquisitorial comrades. Well, more spying on than liaising with, but anyone who's been an LSO can tell you it's practically the same thing. Sysitat wasn't returning our calls, and our former team had relocated from the Hab base without leaving a forwarding address. The other team hadn't moved, though, and over the next 2 weeks, Doc occasionally drove over to chat with their friendly old adept surgeon about our former teammates' health and all the medications Ivana wasn't taking. For some reason, his visits just so happened to coincide with the times when everyone else was out of the base, and it always seemed that either the Fringe Worlder or Torser Priest had left a copy of their latest briefings lying around the medbay. The fact that Doc's half-assed espionage got us more intel than we'd ever gotten while on Sysitat's actual bloody team should really illustrate the man's opinion of us. In any case, most of the stuff Doc got was about the stupid artifacts, which were decidedly not our problem, but there were some useful tidbits on the sorcerers too. Between what he got and Sarge's stuff on Bane, we had enough to get started with, and before long the plan began to take shape. The basic theory hadn't changed much since its initial inception, but since it was cooked up by a bunch of tired, shot-up grunts in the back of a van on the way home from a catastrophically failed op, that probably wasn't something to brag about. In any case, the first step was splitting up our targets. Bane was threatening enough on his own, and we shuddered at the thought of what he could do if someone with an actual functioning brain was calling the shots. Of course, of the pair, he'd be the easier one to distract, and Tink had a surprisingly good idea for that. The problem was that Angelica knew this too, and was good about keeping an eye on him. We needed to fix that. Now, it wasn't like Little Miss Trader Pants was always hanging on Bane's arm. In fact, she left him to his own devices fairly frequently, which we felt disproved Ivana's assertion that she was compromised too. We weren't exactly sure what she was doing during these absences, probably plotting treason or enacting dark rituals, which Bane would find boring, or maybe she was off negotiating with various powerful male figures who'd respond poorly to her boy toy's presence. In any case, whether Angelica went off on her own, she always dropped Bane off on a certain Uphive club, which we dubbed his daycare, along with at least one of her doubles and a few other helpers, who presumably were just there to call her whenever he got bored and wandered off. So far, she'd always arrived on the scene and sidetracked him before he managed to overload a Hive's fusion reactor or something, but it was always probably only a matter of time. The point is that before we could neutralize Bane, we'd need to arrange for Angelica to be distracted too. The problem was that there was only a very limited number of things that would get her attention. 5 of them, to be specific, if Sysitat's little briefing on his stupid artifact was to be believed. This might be the point where we started to go just a little off the rails, well, at least according to our defense counsel. I mean, it wasn't like we set out intending to steal the artifact, it was just that, of the 5, Angelica and Bane already had 2, the Crime Lords and another they'd gotten earlier, and there was the one that we'd blown up, on orders, and finally one that Ivana said her team had retrieved, which meant that Sysitat had it now. This just left one spooky artifact out in the wild, and we didn't much like our chances of getting to it before the people who were, actually trained for that sort of stuff. We did look into other options, such as Twitch's perfectly reasonable idea of mining all the roots out of the upper hive and just waiting until Angelica found the last artifact herself. The problem was that even though the number of roots between hives was limited by the massive rock storm, it stops being a sand or dust once it's bigger than a grape, they couldn't possibly mine all of them. Well, actually, we probably could. We were beyond well stocked at this point, but you can't just leave massive piles of explosives lying around on pieces of crucial hive infrastructure. Someone might steal them. Anyway, if she found the artifact on her own, she'd probably bring Bane with her, which was exactly what we were trying to avoid here. We also toyed with the idea of just creating a fake artifact, which we could be sent someplace. Bane wasn't welcome, such as the Merchant Cartel. One of the reports Doc had gotten a few pictures of the last artifact, another spooky box thing. and Tink was fairly certain he could rig up a close enough duplicate out of cardboard or something. Even better, since there wouldn't be any actual artifact stuff inside, we could just pack the Bach itself full of explosive. Both Sarge and Doc vetoed this idea on the grounds that it involved the words fairly, close enough, and cardboard. Also, she was a psyker and would presumably be able to tell the difference between an ancient Eldritch artifact and a forgery, regardless of the quality. Ivana put forward a whole other notion for bait: Inquisition agents, specifically us. After all, she reasoned, if Angelica hated us so much, she was sure to come down to personally tear our limbs from our bodies and crush our skulls with her bare hands. At least, that's what Ivana would do. We, very, very cautiously, explained that while this was an excellent idea and everyone appreciated her suggestion, A, we'd been bait before and hadn't much liked it, B, no, she wouldn't come anywhere for us, she might send Bane or have an orbital strike called in, or send the entirety of the secret police, but we highly doubted that she'd show up in person, even to gloat, at least not until we were all good and dead. Now, if it was Sysitat, on the other hand, or maybe one of his favorite minions, well, that was something worth thinking about, or it would have been if we weren't totally above that sort of thing. So we really did do our due diligence on this, but it was just that we had to get an artifact of our own, and of the 4 still existing, we only knew where one of them was. It was inevitably Nubby who raised the question of if, just hypothetically, Sysitat really needed his. After all, if Angelica and Bane were dead, wouldn't that practically solve his whole scavenger hunt problem for him? It would be for the greater good, as the Tau weirdos would say. The saner members of the squad watched in increasing alarm as first Twitch, then Tink, and Ivana chimed in to add their support and began planning what was quite possibly the most harebrained heist in Inquisitorial history. When they got to the part with the clown masks and the giant wood badger, Sarge finally put his foot down. He stated in no uncertain terms their heist was the exact sort of stupidity we'd been fighting with since we'd first volunteered for Inquisitorial service, and that wasn't even touching on the fact that we didn't actually know if the artifact was still in the other team's base, or how shaky our plan for baiting out only Angelica was. We were not even remotely qualified for this sort of thing. Fortunately, we knew a few people who were. Admittedly, they were the exact same people we were planning on stealing the artifact from, but that just put us in a uniquely good position to get it for us. All we had to do was convince 1 or 2 of Sysitat's minions to sell him out, and according to Ivana, there was one specific person who was uniquely primed to do just that: his interrogator. Sure, she seemed to be the man's most loyal follower, and probably hated our guts even more than he did, but if what Ivana said about being compromised was true... At first, we hadn't put much stake in Ivana's whole compromised thing. But then the other team's surgeon asked Doc for a consultation on the ganger who'd been kept in medical confinement ever since her encounter with Bane. It hadn't been pretty. The trash-talking, mohawk-sporting gun nut who reminded us a lot of Amy had been reduced to something like a strung-out Obscura junkie, except somehow so much worse. Every conversation with her inexorably turned to him. Had Doc seen him? Did Doc know anything about him? Had Doc met him? When Doc came back, he had a quiet word with the rest of us about taking Ivana more seriously, which we did. Not that we much liked the end result. Mind you, even if Ivana was right and the interrogator was just brain damaged as the ganger, only a lot better at hiding it, that didn't mean she would go steal the artifact just because we asked nicely. We needed to phrase our request just right. Make it clear that all we wanted the artifact for was to kill Angela, the evil, manipulative sorceress controlling poor, impressionable Bane Johns. We certainly didn't have any desire to try and kill him. We were a bunch of cowards, after all. Hell, with some more, interrogator-like guiding him, he might just be willing to come back to the Inquisitorial service. That would never happen if Sysitat got his way, though. All he cared about was his artifacts. Once he got them, he'd just run off again, leaving Bane under Angelica and the conspiracy's control. Yeah, the real problem wasn't so much the phrasing as keeping a straight face, especially since it would be Doc doing the delivery. Which is why instead of making his pitch to the interrogator directly, he went and visited the one person even more compromised than she supposedly was. Doc wasn't very happy about his role in the Operation Exploit the Mentally Traumatized for strategic gain, but he grudgingly made one last trip to the other team's base. With the equally grudging help of their surgeon, our medic had the most obviously staged conversation in the history of espionage in the front of the ganger, who briefly escaped during the interrogator's next visit to their base. The fact that this all somehow worked was mind-boggling. A few days after the doc's visit, we received a calligraphied note informing us a distraction would be drawing the sorceress's personal attention to the Jack Hive. Day after tomorrow. 2 days of frantic scrambling later, Sarge and Ivana were in position on a maintenance walkway overlooking Interchange 7JU4, trying to look as bored and PDF-like as possible, and hoping their heavy weapons weren't visible from the lanes below. Across the way, Doc was leaned against an inappropriately camo-netted las cannon, desperately trying to ignore Nubby's dissertation on the inherent deviousness of all women. Above both groups, perched on the network of pipes clinging to the underside of Junction 16's northbound overpass, Twitch sat with his pile of detonators, watching the incoming traffic like an especially jumpy hawk, and periodically rechecking the distance markers he placed on the roadside. 30 kilometers away, some of them were vertical, Tink double-checked his comms connection to the auxiliaries, watched his chrono tick down to 0, and stepped into 7 Hive's most famous club. He then sheepishly stepped back out and proceeded around to the service entrance before the bouncer tore his head off. At T plus 15 minutes, Tink had changed into his disguise, delivered his package, and was in position in the discreet spot of the bribed paparazzi had told him about. At 21 of the lookouts Nubby had hired, honorably tired PDF veterans every one of them, reported a flyer with a planetary government IFF transponder landing, and a man with a real fancy leggedy exiting. Tink switched his data slate over the appropriate feed, and immediately recognized Bane and Angelica, and switched to visuals as they entered the club proper and proceeded to their usual spot. He watched them carefully as they settled in and ordered drinks, patiently waiting for the moment when Angelica would quietly slip away. Then he kept waiting. Over an hour and 3 false alarms later, Sarge calmed Tink to check in what was taking so long. The techie, in turn, called his increasingly annoyed observers to check for the 9th time whether any vehicles with the appropriate fast lane tags had left the garages. He got a combination of drunken slurring, hacking coughs, mutters about shrimp, and quacking, which equated to a firm no, except from the landing pad team, who angrily, not to mention drunkenly, told him they hadn't seen anyone at all since the flyer dropped Bane off, and one with the hot pilot had left to park somewhere else. Tink briefly considered the merits of mass hobo murder, possibly followed by suicide, especially when his observers explained that no, they hadn't watched where it went. They'd been diligently keeping their IFF readers pointed at the pad and waiting for Tink's word that the target was leaving. After a few deep calming breaths, he called Sarge back to let him know there might be a problem. Sarge did not take it well. In the face of catastrophic mission failure and an enraged non-com's inexorable wrath, Tink did what came naturally, loudly complaining about how it wasn't his fault. He was the only one of us who hadn't been on the whole Angelica mission. He'd only seen her the one time at the crime lord's place. How was he supposed to tell if it was her or a double? And anyway, it was Nubby who hired a bunch of random drunken bums to be our spotters. None of it was Tink's fault. His part of the plan was actually working fine. Bane had already gone through 3 bottles of the exceedingly fancy stimulant-infused liquor Tink had delivered, and he was ready to put his distraction into play at a moment's notice. In fact, he could do it right now without the body double there, because his plans always work. Sarge screamed at him to do absolutely nothing without further orders, and then cut the comms. In the pained silence that followed, Doc quietly told Sarge it was probably time to call Sysitat and tell him what was happening. He could actually hear the non-con's teeth gritting from the far side of the interchange, but didn't get a response. Rather than argue, the medic just sighed, dialed his long-range comm to the surgeon's number himself, and asked her to forward up from the line. He'd gotten as far as the torso priest, whose immediate response was to ask what we'd fucked up, before Sarge finally manned up and grudgingly took over the call. Now, Sarge had been embarrassed before. In fact, since joining the Inquisition, he'd been the most embarrassed that he'd ever been in his entire life on several occasions. It didn't seem possible. Surely there was some upper limit where he wouldn't actually die that he'd actually die of it, but somehow he kept managing to reach new heights. His conversation with Syssitat, admitting that we'd lost the sorceress who was probably halfway to Jack Hive to pick up an artifact, maybe just possibly from the cartel's subspire, was one of those moments. He did at least manage to remember the old diplomacy advice about admitting things, but it was a bit of a moot point, since the Inquisitor's first words were, "It was you!" Actually, skipping over the abuse, mockery, and general angry Inquisitor noises, Syssitat took it surprisingly well. He eventually confirmed Angelica's arrival in Jack Hive via the governmental VAC train and her acquisition of the artifact and agreed to track her for us. He even grudgingly admitted that we'd chosen the best spot for our ambush, which was vaguely worrying given that we'd never told him that. He instructed us to hold position and refrained from contacting him again. He'd let us know when Angelica was on her way back and would provide tracking information once she was in our hive. But in the meantime, he had far, far more important things to do. Sarge accepted this as gracefully as he could manage. Despite Syssitat's assurance he'd warn us in time, the wait was absolutely nerve-wracking. Tink had the worst of it, sitting across from an increasingly drunk Bane and Angelica look-alike. He was on the verge of activating the distraction himself, whatever Sarge said, when the 30-minute warning finally came through. The techie breathed a sigh of relief as he finally got the word go, redonned his white coat and cheap wig, and did one last check to make sure he had the right address for the Arbite Precinct Fortress. Bane Johns, interplanetary man of mystery, lovable rogue, and all-around badass, had been having an okay night, all things considered. Sure, Inquisitor girlfriend had ditched on their date, and the arm candy he was being especially fussy tonight, but the new drink they were serving was absolutely amazing. He was definitely getting bored, though, and the chick was starting to really harsh his groove. Maybe it was time for a nice walk. He always found something interesting to do when he went for a walk. Inquisitor girlfriend would nag him afterwards, but she never stayed mad. She understood a man as awesome as him had needs. Bane was about to ditch when what's-her-name got all bothered about something and left on her own. He didn't worry about it. Chicks did that sometimes when they were bored of him. He was on his way to the windows, doors were so passé, when an old little guy with a briefcase in one hand and a huge bottle of that new drink in the other walked up to him. He thought the guy looked a bit familiar, but he stopped worrying when the geezer pressed the bottle into his hand and opened up the case. Bane's eyes lit up as he took the impressive array of gadgets, a beautiful pair of autoguns, and reconnaissance photos featuring a sinister-looking building and a nicely filled-out young woman. "The planetary's governor hot daughter has been kidnapped by ninjas. Are you bad enough, dude, to save the planetary governor's hot daughter?" Sarge grinned with relief as his PDF issue scanner picked up on the first confused chatter of the Arbites band. He reminded Tink to return as soon as he was sure Bane didn't need any more combead prodding, and turned his attention to the ambush. According to Syssitat, now that Angelica had her prize, she was traveling in a 6-vehicle, semi-armored secret police convoy. Not that the armor would do much good against the literal crates of high explosive that had been crammed under the interchange. Admittedly, there was going to be a bit of a collateral damage, but this was inquisitorial business. The civvy body counts would be positively minuscule compared to, say, an exterminatus. The non-com was doing a final weapons check with Ivana, not that they'd really needed once the explosives had done their bit, when he received the final awaited from Syssitat. What Sarge and the rest of us were expecting was a last-minute update on which of the reserved lanes under Angelica would be taking. What we got was a slightly breathless warning from the Inquisitor that the convoy had started turning towards Underhive, possibly to take the artifact to some secret warehouse instead of the secret police HQ, Bane's nightclub, or even the Arbit Precinct. Like we'd planned for. She'd still be passing through the interchange, just on a completely different and far lower section than the one that we'd set the ambush on. Sarge didn't even stop to swear, there wasn't time, and he didn't know any words vile enough for the current snafu anyway. He just grabbed as many crack launchers as he could carry and started sprinting along the walkway. Ivana shrugged and jogged after him, carrying their heavy bolter in one hand and humming to herself. On the far side of the interchange from Sarge and Ivana, Doc hastily plotted a slightly longer route down to the new ambush point and dragged Nubby away from the las cannon before the trooper could voice any complaints about how much it had cost. Twitch watched them go from his perch above the interchange, spent a few seconds debating whether it would be worth setting off his charges anyway, just in case some stray debris knocked out the lower section, and regrettably ditched his neatly arranged row of detonators. As the demolitions trooper attached his rappel gear, he warned the rest of us that he was going to be a little late to the party. Doc suggested we meet up with Tink, who was racing towards us on a PDF messenger bike, simultaneously trying to dodge slower traffic, direct Bane to the Arbit Marshal Office, and take off his quartermaster agent disguise. Tink tried to reply, but it just came out as inarticulate cursing. Sarge skidded into position just in time to see the convoy's lead vehicle around the corner. He signaled Ivana to keep moving and get her a better firing position, while he started prepping his 3 cracks for rapid fire. A distant corner of his mind registered a voice on the comm bead instructing him to call off the ambush so Angelica could be tracked to her artifact warehouse. He instructed the voice to have relations with several varieties of farm animals, sighted his first crack on the middle of the section, and started counting down. Farther along the walkway, Ivana found a security door marked stairwell and casually kicked it off its hinges. One of the startled maintenance workers inside informed her that she couldn't do that, realized he was obviously wrong about that, and stepped aside. His partner didn't, and regretted the decision for the rest of his life. Ivana reached the level above the roadway a few seconds after the maintenance worker, but unlike him, she stopped there and exited right as Sarge's countdown hit 0. The first crack missile was right on target. It punched through the armored glass of the lead car's windshield like wet paper, reducing the vehicle and its occupants to flaming wreckage before they even registered the attack. The second car, driving slightly farther back and left in the other reserved governmental lane, spun out as it tried to evade and cartwheeled a good 50 meters before it came to a stop. None of its occupants got out before Sarge's second crack hit its exposed undercarriage. The rest of the cars in the convoy, including the more heavily armored limo at its center, reacted professionally enough, but they were in remarkably shit tactical situation. There was obvious advantages to taking the governmental fast lanes, with their secured entry points and the chest-high barrier separating them from the common rabble clogging the rest of the highway, but the disadvantage was being pretty much trapped in a 2-lane kill box. The only smart, more available was to try to burst through the wreck on the first cars and keep moving, but 3 more cracks, Sarge's last 1 and 2 from where Doc and Nubby had just come out from the wall above them, were enough to completely block the way. With a massive pileup of other governmental vehicles already blocking the way behind, the secret police took the only option left to them and started getting out to return fire. From her slightly elevated position and across the highway from the convoy, Ivana opened up on the disembarking secret police with her heavy bolter, greatly increasing the panic levels in the 8 lanes between them. Above her, Sarge cursed himself for not bringing any more cracks or his nade launcher and started trading lasfire with the well-covered men below. He didn't land many hits, but between him and Ivana, they had the entire convoy nice and distracted for Doc and Nubby's follow-up attack. After a short debate over targets, Doc and Nubby decided the best thing to do was stick to the objective, and 2 cracked missiles slammed directly into the roof of the still upended limo in the middle of the convoy. Admittedly, it was a bit overkill, given that they were firing anti-tank ordnance, but the 2 guardsmen felt it was best to play things safe. You can imagine how surprised and disappointed they were when the smoke cleared to reveal a burned, scattered, but still intact limo now glowing with a faint pinkish purple light. Lacking any better ideas, Doc and Nubby started tossing grenades as fast as they could grab, hoping for a lucky hit with a crack nade or something, but only managed a few glancing hits before returning fire from the secret police forced them back into cover. It was at this point that the fight began to stall. As well as our opener had gone, we'd blown all our whole cards. There had still been at least 10 secret police agents, still standing there in their armored cars, and they made damn good cover even from grenades. We had them pinned, but the time was on their side, and they knew it. We only had so long before reinforcements started pouring in, and we'd be all sorts of shit. Nubby suggested a run back for more cracks, and Doc wanted to wait for Twitch and Tink, but Sarge vetoed and gave them orders to advance. It really said something about the situation that nobody objected. As Sarge dropped down and began pushing through 8 lanes of semi-stalled traffic, and Nubby and Doc left their nice safe drainage pipe to take turns sprinting down the exterior stairs below them, Tink finally reached the interchange. The techie cut off his call to Bane with a final hammed-up death gurgle and directions to avenge him, and tried to figure out just where in the hell the giant concrete's rat's nest the fight was taking place. Tink's attempts to get directions from his distracted teammates were interrupted by someone dialing his comm bead directly and screaming, "Stop this truck!" in his ear. Tink looked around in confusion, eliciting more yelling. Finally, he spotted a tanker wallowing through the traffic next to him and a small figure jumping up and down on top of it. Tink took in the size of the tank, the bright red flammable markings on its sides, and the det pack in Twitch's hands. The techie then briefly tried to remember how many crates of explosives they packed in the bridge he was currently riding on before giving up, weaving through the traffic towards the tanker with a shout of, "Oh shit, Twitch, you're just gonna get us all killed." The surviving agents of Task Force Spectre, handpicked by the Inquisitor herself to act as her last line of defense, let out a ragged cheer as the mystery attackers suddenly began pulling back. Their cheers were cut short by a massive crunching sound above them, and they looked up nearly 8 levels to an overpass above them and a truck cab hanging over its edge. All 9 agents watched, too stunned to even notice a chunk of debris that flattened their commander, as the truck teetered on the lip for a second, before finally tipping and dropping directly towards them. The limo's occupant, unsure what was happening, peeked out from the door for a second before slamming it shut and pouring every ounce of her newfound powers into her shield. The tanker was about 10 meters off the ground when the det packs on its side detonated in a massive, yet oddly wet-sounding whoop. The explosion was big, just not as big as we'd expected, which was honestly a good thing given how close to it all some of us were. Instead of the massive fireball and concussive shock that we'd expected, what we got was a flaming spray like the world's largest incendiary grenade, covering the entire highway in burning fuel. The smell was, well, familiar. Up on the overpass, Tink turned to the man next to him, who was looking over the edge with the rapt expression of someone who always wanted to do that. He then reread the words, "No shit services for all your septic needs" on the man's coveralls, then looked at Twitch, who shrugged and muttered about being the best he could find. Tink shook his head. Both guardsmen hook up their drop harnesses to the railing and rappelled down into the quite literal flaming shit show below. The septic worker saluted them. Sarge was the first to arrive at the smoking epicenter of the explosion, but the rest of us weren't far behind. As we arrived, we heard a faint, melodious voice cursing and screaming somewhere inside the flames and smoke. Then a blast of lightning knocked Sarge off his feet. The singed non-com spared a second to thank the Emperor for carapace armor and rolled into cover while the rest of us sprayed fire into the smoke. Somewhere inside, Angelica screamed something eldritch-sounding, and demonic figures started rising out of the muck. At least, we thought they were demonic. It was hard to say because we just kept shooting, taking them out before they could really finish forming. I mean, we'd seen this trick, 50 times now? 100? Angelica and her bullshit might have been intimidating back in the early days, but after spending a few months with the demon thrope, well... As we mowed down the whatever they were, not shit demons, whatever Tink said, Twitch and Sarge began tossing short fuse frags into the cloud until we were finally rewarded with a pained yelp and a filth-splattered figure zipping out of the smoke. Once again, Sarge was hit in the chest, except this time by 2 amazingly aimed pistol bolter rounds, knocking the burly non-com back a good 2 meters and pretty much destroying what was left of his chest armor. He was still capable of swearing, though, so Doc declared him stable and joined the rest of us, firing at the sprinting figure. Angelica was moving at a fair clip, but her shield seemed to be failing between 3 lasguns and a plasma gun, and in Ivana's bolter, we managed to tag her at least twice. She still managed to reach the maintenance door she was aiming for, though, slicing through it with that sword of hers and rolling through the gap into the tunnel beyond. We followed at a more leisurely pace and felt a nice warm tingly sensation as she discovered it was a supply closet. It was quite possibly the most beautiful cursing we'd ever heard, in multiple ways. All of us, except for Sarge, who was still trying to remember how his legs worked, fanned out around the door. Angelica stopped cursing. In an impressively haughty voice, given the circumstances, she announced that she was Liber Demonica with her, and we'd never be able to kill her without destroying it. She informed us it was a stalemate and instructed us to get our Inquisitor so she could make a deal with him. Doc shrugged, looked over his shoulder, and asked Sarge if he cared about any Liberwhatsits. The acting Inquisitor told him where he could shove any stupid artifacts, and Doc passed that information on, along with an entire bouquet of incendiary grenades, courtesy of Twitch. What came back out of the maintenance closet might have been ex-interrogator Angelica Dominicus, but it sure as shit wasn't human. Despite the claws, the tentacles, and uncomfortable places, and all the flames, it was still somehow feminine, though, and it moved with a familiar, lithe grace. The voice, though, that was something entirely alien, like a cross between honey and broken glass, accompanied by an invasive, pulsing something. We stared in shock as whatever it was pressed inwards, trying to worm its way in through our ears, but only for a second. Before it had taken its second step, all 6 of us, including a slightly unsteady Sarge, open-fired. It got 3 more steps, but not 4. We only stopped firing when we ran dry. By that point, there wasn't much left but a smoldering, pulsating lump. While the rest of us reloaded, Nubby, in violation of 17 varieties of common sense, took a few steps forward to inspect this pile. He stopped short as a familiar pained voice called his name and asked him to save her. The trooper looked down into the somehow intact face and the eyes of ex-interrogator Angelica, who smiled at him and called him her knight in shining armor. Nubby smiled back and informed her it wasn't working out. Twitch offered her another incendiary bouquet as consolation. As much as we'd have loved to sit and watch our ex-bosses remains smolder in the hive light, there wasn't time. The ambush had only taken a short while, only about a dozen or 2 rounds, as our professionals call them, but the secret police had to have reinforcements on the way, and they probably wouldn't call things off just because their boss was dead. Even more worryingly, the combead Tinkin Given Bane was completely dead, and we could overhear chatter about something leaving the Arbites HQ at high speed. It was time to get moving, and if possible, avoid dealing with any freakishly powerful secret agent types until we'd at least had time to patch ourselves up. Sarge had a bit of support from Ivana, led the way back towards the side of the interchange where the faithful cargo truck had been stored. As we moved, the non-com put in a courtesy call to Syssitat to let him know that Angelica was dead, but didn't get through, so he had Doc leave it with the surgeon instead, not to mention made any spooky liber things, though. We were just entering the stairwell when a high-pitched whining sound drew our attention up towards the top of the interchange. An Arbit Eagle shuttle, pouring out smoke from its engines and weaving a tad drunkenly, shot down out of the sky, caromed off 2 walls, a support pillar, and a truck full of mattresses in physically improbable manner, and skidded to a halt in the general vicinity of the maintenance closet. From the far side of traffic, we heard a distant, surprisingly heartfelt sounding "No!" As the pitch rose and got angrier, Sarge instructed the rest of us to move faster. So no shit, there we were, standing just across the street from a grief-stricken, psychically superpowered, self-proclaimed secret agent, a man who'd killed at least 2 Inquisitors, single-handedly blown up an entire warp ship, tackled an orc freebooter with nothing more than a pocket knife, and had just spent the last hour shooting up the planet's Arbit HQ for fun. A man who may or may not have been a demon host, and was shacked up with quite possibly the most dangerous woman we'd ever met until she'd been killed. By us. Very, very thoroughly. We decided that it was time to start running. The plan was still to kill Bane, of course. It just was that we didn't particularly feel like doing it right now. We felt like we deserved a few hours off to go grab a bite, get some light medical treatment, and maybe catch a quick nap. The universe felt otherwise. As we piled our way into the stairwell, Bane's dramatic moment was cut short by the arrival of a squad of Arbite float bikes, 2 of which spontaneously collided midair, and a very one-sided gunfight started moving straight towards us. Still, though, we could think of a dozen places we'd rather duke it out with Bane than in the middle of a packed highway covered with burning sewage, directly underneath a massive pile of explosives, so we started sprinting up the stairs away. We pushed out our our way past a few confused emergency services types, including a pair hauling a broken-legged maintenance worker up to the level that had left the garage that we were parked. At this point, Tink did some quick math, called a halt, and informed the rest of us that it was time to ditch our more unreliable assets before they became a liability. A dozen levels below us, Bane Johns kicked the last of the Arbites through the maintenance door and entered the stairwell about the same time as 37 assorted grenades reached his level. The vast majority of the grenades either overshot, undershot, failed to detonate, or somehow bounced out the door past Bane, but judging by the swearing and the faint "mwop" sound, at least one of them flashes must have hit the target. Not that being blinded stopped the man from opening fire and somehow managing to hit the back of Doc's helmet, a tank of fire suppressant on one of the first responders' backs, and a crippled maintenance guy, twice. Twitch hastily moved his explosive-filled pack around to his front side and led the retreat down the foam-filled hallway until Nubby passed him. Nubby found the exit of the parking garage blocked by even more emergency service guys and a fire truck. Time being of the essence, rather than ask nicely, the little trooper bellowed at them to make a hole, kicked two in the shins, and left the rest to Ivana and Sarge, who scattered the stragglers like bowling pins. As he passed, Twitch tossed his pack to a temporarily nervous-looking fireman and instructed him to run for the love of the Emperor, start running. The guy took one look at the bag, started screaming, and did. Our trusty cargo wasn't parked far away. Most of us piled in and started swapping gear and doing field repairs, both on our kit and ourselves, as fast as possible. Tink, looking around and taking in a number of explodable vehicles filling the garage, decided that this was just about the second worst place to fight Bane, and we got in the driver's seat instead. Those of us in the rear were abruptly thrown to the floor, then the wall, and then the other wall, as Tink attempted to drift the six-wheeler down the garage's exit ramps before Bane finished whatever the hell he was doing to those poor fire guys. As we hit the street, shedding the last of our explosives and very nearly Doc behind us, Tink took a second to congratulate himself on his genius and floored it. He then yelped and attempted to floor it even harder as a burst of static arced along his hands and the radio spontaneously played a 7-note sting, and the frickin' fire truck burst through the parking garage's wall 4 levels above us. Bane, hanging out of the door, driving one-handed, grinned madly at us as he opened fire. Fortunately, his aim was a bit off. Instead of pancaking us, the fire truck came down in the opposite lane, smashing directly into an oncoming truck and setting both off in a disproportionately large purple-tinged fireball. His bullets were a bit wide off the mark too, or at least that's what we thought, until 2 of our tires exploded. Tink swore and tried to maintain control, but only managed to hold for a few seconds before Bane, having somehow been propelled over us by the blast, took out both of our front tires as well. There was a confusing and bumpy few seconds for those of us in the back as the techie narrowly managed to avoid sending us over a looming drop all the way to the underhive, somehow skewed us between a pair of oncoming buses, and finally plowed our sturdy vehicle through the side of one of the buildings lining the road. Having unanimously decided it was time for us to get off Mr. Tink's wild ride, we disembarked and found ourselves in some sort of warehouse. Twitch hastily inspected the markings on the nearest crates for any warning stickers, didn't notice anything more sinister than Munitorum-grade tobacco substitute, and declared the warehouse as non-hazardous as we'd get. Sarge gave the order to take up defensive positions. 2 minutes of tense waiting later, Tink made a get-on-with-it gesture as Sarge, who just glared back. Ivana sighed, rolled her eyes, and announced that not even Bane Johns could stop us now. The skylight above her exploded inward. As Bane landed, we noticed the bastard wasn't quite looking his unusual, unruffled self. Back when we first came up with the whole distraction plan, there had been a bit of a debate over who to sick Bane on. We wound up deciding that given how much trouble a certain member of theirs had given us, the Arbites owed us a favor, and man did the boys in black deliver. While the bastard was still upright and looked suavely self-confident as ever, he'd collected a dozen minor scrapes and bruises, and from the look of things, some probably deceased hero of an Arbite had popped him square in the eye with a shock maul. Even more importantly, though, the man was breathing heavily, and as he dropped down into the warehouse without a rope or grab chute, a distinctly warpy breeze had come with him. Just this once, we took that as a good sign. Upon landing right in front of Sarge and Ivana, Bane launched into his whole spiel about how he don't know who you guys are and what you wanted, but you had a very particular set of skills and so on. We all just stood there, listening to him monologue like a bunch of idiots until Twitch abruptly snapped out of it and opened fire. The rest of us immediately shook whatever it was off and followed suit, pouring 5 lasguns and 1 bolter's worth of fire after the man as he dodged backwards behind a row of crates. None of the shots hit, of course, but we hadn't really expected them to, at least not yet. The killing part would come later, for now it was all about keeping up the pressure, which is why Sarge and Ivana pushed forwards after him, while the rest of us moved around the flanks to cut him off. The theory was simple: wear the bastard out. If this stupid danger zone of his worked by skewing probability, or stealing our numbers as Twitch put it, then we were betting it took a lot more psychic juice to flip a 90-10 than a 50-50. Our goal was to put as much fire on him as accurately as possible and do it without leaving any handy options for his bullshit powers to work on. The last bit was where Tink's little secret weapon project came in. At the end of his extensive testing, Tink had handed us each what had to have been the oldest, wellest used lasguns any of us had ever seen. They were completely unmodified, none of them matched, and we had no idea what pattern any of them were. We strongly suspected that they were all older than the hive we were standing on, maybe even pre-heresy, but it was hard to be sure since the serial numbers had been worn away ages ago, except for Sarge's, which still faintly read Urge of Mars, serial number 000-000-000-000-007. Still, despite all appearances, Tink assured us that they were the most reliable weapons on the planet, with only a single minor misfire between them in over 2 weeks of relentless fire testing. Twitch had immediately claimed the one that had misfired, asserting that the rest of ours were ticking time bombs, while Ivana had refused to part with her customized Godwin D's boulders, claiming that she'd had it for longer than she remembered. Tink wisely decided not to press her. Of course, these new weapons didn't pack the same punch as our hotshots, or the shiny new plasma gun Tink had fired all of 8 times before unceremoniously tossing it out the truck's window. But the point was, when you pulled the trigger, a laser always came out. Combine that with the lack of ricochets for Bane to pull off his bullshit with, it was all that we could really ask for. Well, not really, but it was certainly all we were going to get. Rather than let Sarge and Ivana bum rush him, Bane came around Doc and Nubby's side of the crates and took a dive. The man was firing both his fancy little auto pistols, not the specially inaccurate ones Tink had given him, on full auto, and somehow managed to simultaneously knock out a control line, one of Nubby's augmetic legs, and hit Doc in both the shoulder and the helmet, all before even hitting the ground. The pair's return fire missed wildly as Doc's legs spazzed out and sent him plowing into the medic. As Nubby's legs spazzed out. Tink and Twitch, firing down the road, did considerably better though, forcing Bane into another acrobatic dive, this time enhanced by a blast of howling wind, which sent Doc and Nubby the rest of the way to the ground as he launched over them. Rounding the corner, Sarge and Ivana both took pot shots at the magical flying interrogator, then sprinted after him as he passed behind a stack of boxes. Sarge was still sprinting when he reached Bane's row, which turned out to be a mistake. The non-com threw himself into a dive, but misjudged his aim and plowed straight into a large shelving unit, catching 4 auto-pistol bullets and a small but surprisingly heavy crate to the groin in the bargain. Behind him, Ivana rounded up the corner a bit more carefully and stitched a line of bolt rounds after Bane as he ran up the same shelving stack. As admittedly cool as the maneuver was, it also took the man up into Tink and Twitch's line of fire, and the universe went slightly runny around the edges as the pair lined up their shots. For a brief second, the warehouse was replaced by screaming something, with Bane hovering in the middle of it, cackling. Then Tink's weapons misfired. Twitch's didn't, and Bane dropped back down off the shelves with a girly little yelp as a lasbolt grazed his thigh. Bane didn't hit the ground, not because he'd started flying again, but because Ivana caught him by the front of the tux and pinned him upside down against the wall. The big woman grinned ear to ear as she shoved her bolter into his chest and pulled the trigger, only to pause and stare down in confusion as nothing happened. Even half-blinded with pain, Sarge could see what was coming next and tried to shout a warning, as apparently forgetting years of guard training, she pulled the trigger again. The blast, as first one of the bolt rounds, then the other, and then the entire rest of the magazine blew out, Ivana backwards through the opposite wall of crates, while somehow leaving Bane standing upright, wiping burning specks of propellant off his lapels. We didn't leave the smug bastard time to gloat. Sarge rolled the rest of the way to his feet and opened fire, only to swear as the warehouse was filled with demonic whispers, and his weapon jammed too. Operating on only slightly better instinct than Ivana had been, the Nomcom hupped his ancient, supposedly unjammable jammed weapon at Bane's face. He missed, of course, and Doc came around the corner just in time to catch 4 kilos of rapidly spinning metal to the nose. Fortunately, it didn't go off, and Bane was too busy laughing to even register Sarge's fist before it hit him in the gut. Nubby, lagging considerably behind Doc, paused at the spot where Ivana had come to rest, and since the medic was busy, promoted himself to Dr. Nubbs. He decided that, in his professional opinion, the patient needed 30-something-somethings of slot cut with stim, and maybe just a little friend-zone. You know, to take the edge off. Twitch and Tink entered the row to find Sarge in the middle of what might have been described as a kung fu battle, one that Sarge, despite being stronger, faster, and undoubtedly meaner, was definitely losing. Tink, confident in his ability to fire into the melee, announced it was time to even the odds and shot Sarge in the arm. Twitch suggested that he not try that again and started moving closer. Sarge, who was starting to really feel the broken ribs and blood loss and was getting really tired of the little voice that kept promising him untold power in exchange for a small price, decided that enough was enough. As the bastard wound up for another of his stupidly effective chop thingies, the non-com rushed in the blow and pulled the combat knife. He was very surprised when halfway through his attack everything went wobbly and suddenly the knife wasn't in his hand anymore. Sarge paused, perplexed, and tried to figure out where it had gone. It wasn't in his right hand where it was supposed to be, and his left hand appeared to be missing entirely, which seemed vaguely worrying. He directed his gaze downward, and was relieved to find the missing blade was merely lodged in his chest. He hadn't lost it at all. Secure in the knowledge that the commissar wouldn't be angry with him at misplacing his war gear, the non-com decided it was time to sit down and take a quick nap. As he nodded off, he vaguely wondered if all the blood around him was his, and if it would be yelled at for making a mess. On both sides of the row, Doc, Twitch, and Tink watched as Sarge staggered backwards and collapsed, and a rain of blood started falling from the warehouse's roof. All 3 of them looked up into the storm, then back down to where Bane was standing over Sarge, and opened fire. Things got very warpy, very fast. Whether it was the blood rain and its notorious effect on psychers, or just that Bane was finally running on empty, the man's powers seemed to go completely haywire as our barrage hit him. It started with a hive quake knocking boxes off the stacks around us, followed by a psychic blast launching Bane into the air like a cannon, and then nagging little whispers at the edge of consciousness abruptly growing into full-on assault. Tinks dropped to the ground, clutching at his head, but Doc and Twitch kept firing as Bane floated back down and bolts of warp energy started to arc around him, narrowly missing Sarge's prone form. Inside all of the lightning, we could faintly hear Bane somehow simultaneously screaming, laughing, and arguing with someone about how things work. Around him, tears in reality started forming, with indistinct hands and tentacles clawing at their edges. Twitch cursed his lack of explosives, tossed a vial of holy water at Bane, who didn't appear to notice, and yelled as the rest of us kept shooting. Not that we needed telling, of course. All of us, including the now upright Tink and Nubby, poured as much fire as we could into the increasingly eldritch figure, and despite the age and piddliness of our weapons, it had a noticeable effect. Chunks of the man started burning off, whether it was from us or his own powers we couldn't say, but what he was turning into didn't seem to be able to regenerate. Yet. As we kept firing and hoping for the best, there was a shout from behind Doc. Ivana ran up, gripping Sarge's lasgun. None of us were quite sure what she was trying to do as she began advancing while hip-firing. She was already in effective range, but whatever it was, it sure as shit backfired. As she reached the ragged skeletal figure, and that was all that was left of Bane, the man's schizophrenic shouting was replaced by something, and a blast of bluish energy launched the woman across the room to land in a sizzling heap. When the flash of light faded, we found ourselves looking at pretty much the same thing, and not a 4-story, axe-wielding demon, thank the Emperor. We were pretty sure that the bluish veins covering what was left of his body were new, though. Same with the steadily growing horns and feathery black wings. We responded to the sudden appearance of an actual, all things unholy, demon host with the calm professionalism of true Inquisition agents and kept firing. Because, honestly, what the hell were we supposed to do? Run? From that? We knew a die-tired situation when we saw one, and anyway, even with his little upgrade, Bane still wasn't looking that healthy. For all we knew, it'd only be a few more shots before he keeled over. Right? Well, actually, the thing's next move certainly seemed in line with our assessment. Instead of descending on us in a storm of demonic fury, it waved a hand in the air and warp rifts around us suddenly solidified. A creature that looked like a horrible amalgamation of 20 different creatures crawled and clawed its way out of the nearest one to Tink and Twitch, while Bane himself started floating upwards to the largest rift in the warehouse. Twitch and Tink immediately shifted their fire and began falling back, while Nubby and Doc kept their fire on Bane, right until the arrival of a second interdimensional horror from a portal on their side of the row. The hard decision of where to focus our fire and whether to desperately try to kill Banes before we were clawed to death by his minions was a tricky one, especially without Sarge there to make it. Fortunately, before we dithered ourselves to death, the problem was simplified for us. Ivana, stained head to toe in blood, whether hers or the warpy stuff, we couldn't tell, came screaming out from the back of the warehouse and hit the slowly rising figure with a flying tackle, yanking Bane down away from the growing portal. As we shifted our fire down to focus on our respective ravenous tentacular things, the blood-covered woman above us wrapped her legs around Bane's waist, grabbed one of his freshly grown rings, and just tore it off. This got the thing's attention, to say the least. It responded by howling and clawing at her face and her sides with set of steadily growing talons. She just ignored this and grabbed the other wing, and the sound as it came off was memorable. Even the creatures paused to turn and watch the pair, trailing a rain of feathers and variously colored blood sank away from the portal, and Bane's demonic screeching reached a new frenzied pitch. Ivana, now missing nearly as many chunks as Bane, shifted her grip to his skull, and with a triumphant scream of "Blood for the Blood God!" popped the whole thing off, newly formed horns and all, like an overripe melon. There was a brief pause, in which she could faintly hear the echoing "as planned," and then the warehouse once again exploded in a blue light, when it, Bane, and his creatures weren't there anymore. Neither was Ivana. As Doc sprinted over to start treatment on Sarge, Twitch turned to Tink and Nubby and asked if they'd just seen that. The techie thought for a second, then firmly stated he definitely hadn't seen any inquisitorial agents declare their loyalty to Khorne before subsequently vanishing into the warp without a trace, and suggested that they never speak of such silliness again. Nubby nodded, as well, and discreetly kicked some empty chem ampules over a nearby shelving unit. Further discussion on the subject was interrupted by a booming voice instructing all occupants to drop their weapons, lie on the floor, and surrender by the order of the Adeptus Arbites and the Emperor's Most Holy Inquisition. We weren't exactly surprised to see the traffic Arbite walking through the door. It just sort of fit the way the day was going, and we took some joy in the fact that some unknown individual had shot him a few dozen times. The 200 or so men in assorted vehicles he had with him, which had apparently been waiting just outside the warehouse for a good portion of the battle, were just icing on the cake. The real surprise was the man who walked in alongside the Arbite. Of all things that we'd expected, Inquisitor Sysitat personally hauling his chubby butt down to the battlefield to rescue our sorry asses certainly wasn't one of them. And as it turned out, we were right not to expect it. Instead of telling his new Arbit buddies that we were all friends here and asking them to help patch us up and secure the site, Sysitat's first order was to get us all in cuffs. Even Sarge, though, at least assigned a pair of Arbite Medicaes to continue Doc's work. Thank the Emperor for that, at least. The man was practically giggling as he explained that no, we certainly weren't members of his team, and suggested that the Arbites should run Sarge's rosettes, both of them, against their databases. His response when the one turned up a completely invalid and the other identified us as Rogue Inquisition Agent Interrogator Greg Sargent and Associates, well, smug doesn't even begin to cover it. The last thing we heard as we were walked out to the waiting APC, or stretchered in Sarge's case, was the damn bastard snickering to himself as he advised the Arbites to ship us directly back to the Inquisitorial Sector headquarters, where, as he put it, they were sure to give us a fair and speedy trial. Well, he was half right.